Do you really think imperialism and colonialism ended when European colonizers packed their bags and left African countries in the mid-20th century? Many proudly point to nations like South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria as shining examples of independence. But what if that independence is nothing more than an illusion? What if the brutal truth is that African countries, for all their flags and anthems, are still shackled, not by armies, but by policies dictated from faraway boardrooms? Let us ask you this. What would you say if we told you that African countries are often powerless to do what's best for their own people? That instead of making their own destinies, they are forced to bow to the rules of two organizations headquartered in the United States? These entities, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, hold the keys to Africa's coffers, offering loans so tempting, yet so deadly, that they come at the price of sovereignty. Whenever they feel African countries need money, the World Bank comes in, offering billions in development loans. On the surface, it seems noble, a chance to build infrastructure, invest in healthcare, or boost education. But here's the catch. The loans are structured in a way that makes repayment nearly impossible. And when the crushing weight of debt begins to suffocate, that's when the IMF steps in, offering short-term loans, this time to help cover the payments of the previous ones. That's when it becomes a trap. These loans come with strings, policies that dictate how governments must run their economies. Orders are given to privatize public assets, end social spending, and open up markets to foreign exploitation. African leaders are left with no room to act in their people's interest, forced instead to play by the rules of those who hold the debt. But how do these two organizations become so powerful that they now decide what happens in these African countries? And why do African leaders go along with this? Why take loans that only deepen poverty? In this video, let's find out. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank present themselves as global institutions of financial aid and economic development. Yet, for much of Africa, they mean a subtler but equally insidious continuation of imperialism. These organizations, often seen as saviors in times of economic distress, have systematically implanted African nations in a cycle of dependency and exploitation. Their policies often serve as tools of neocolonial control, ensuring that Africa remains a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of Western goods. The story of the IMF and World Bank begins in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, where Western powers designed a post-war global economic system. Officially, the goal was to promote international cooperation and rebuild war-torn economies. Unofficially, the framework was structured to secure Western dominance in global finance. The institutions were established with a structure that gave excessive power to wealthier nations. Voting rights were tied to financial contributions, ensuring that nations like the United States and its allies would control key decisions. By the time African nations gained independence and joined these institutions, the rules were already set. African countries, with their minimal voting power, had no real influence over policies that would profoundly impact their economies. At the heart of the IMF and World Bank's control is a system of loans that often do more harm than good. These loans, presented as lifelines, come with conditions that undermine the sovereignty and development of borrowing nations. However, African countries emerging from colonial rule with underdeveloped economies needed financial assistance to rebuild. The loans offered by the IMF and World Bank, however, came with structural adjustment programs that mandated austerity, privatization, and market liberalization. These conditions effectively transformed African economies into sources of cheap raw materials for Western markets. Governments were forced to focus on exporting oil, cocoa, and minerals while dismantling local industries and slashing spending on public services. The result was an abusive cycle of dependency, where countries had to borrow more to service existing debts, ensuring that they remained perpetually indebted to their lenders. However, the true power of the IMF and World Bank lies not in their loans but in the conditions they attach to them. These institutions wield tremendous influence over the internal policies of borrowing nations, dictating everything from economic priorities to social spending. This is neocolonialism, control without direct rule. One of the most damaging conditions imposed by these institutions is the privatization of public assets. African governments were often required to sell off utilities like water, electricity, and transportation to foreign corporations. Apart from this, entire mines and mining rights were given to Western corporations, which mined out precious resources, and this continues to this day. These corporations, driven by profit rather than public good, often increased prices and reduced access, leaving ordinary citizens to bear the burden. Moreover, the dismantling of trade barriers flooded African markets with subsidized Western goods. Local businesses, unable to compete, were crushed, further entrenching dependency on imported products. In essence, the IMF and World Bank ensured that African economies served Western interests, stripping nations of their ability to chart their own course. But things did not end here. The loans and policies came with a human cost. The 1980s, often called Africa's lost decade, marked the peak of this devastation. Countries were encouraged to abandon food self-sufficiency in favor of cash crops for export. This left them vulnerable to global market fluctuations and dependent on expensive food imports. At the same time, austerity measures slashed funding for healthcare and education. Hospitals lacked basic supplies, schools deteriorated, and entire generations were denied the opportunity to escape poverty. The structural adjustments also exacerbated unemployment as industries collapsed under the weight of deregulation and cheap imports. The focus on exports meant that African economies remained at the mercy of Western buyers, unable to develop diversified industries or sustainable growth. In all that, countries could not see that the rhetoric of development aid masked the true purpose of these loans, which was maintaining Western dominance. The World Bank, for example, often funds infrastructure projects like roads and ports, but these are typically designed to facilitate the extraction of resources rather than support local economies. Similarly, IMF loans are presented as stabilizing measures, but the conditions attached hollow out economies, ensuring that nations remain weak and dependent. Therefore, the aid is not a gift, but a tool to perpetuate a global system where the wealth of Africa continues to enrich the West. After knowing this, many question why African leaders continue to engage with these institutions despite the harm they cause. The reasons are complex but often boil down to coercion, desperation, and internal corruption. For many countries, the choice is harsh: accept IMF loans or face economic collapse. That's because the IMF and World Bank wield significant influence over international finance, making it nearly impossible for nations to access alternative sources of credit. Additionally, some leaders prioritize short-term gains or personal enrichment over the long-term well-being of their citizens, accepting loans despite their damaging conditions. The burden of the loan is then shifted to the next government. Now let's know about some examples that show how the World Bank and IMF pay African countries so they stay poor. First, let's look at the case of Egypt. Under President Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt glimpsed a future of sovereignty. Nasser's vision was bold: a state-controlled economy with free education, healthcare, and subsidized necessities like bread and oil. The people cheered, hopeful for equality and progress. But Nasser's dream was too dangerous for global powers to tolerate. When Anwar Sadat took over, he opened the floodgates for Western economic infiltration. His Infitah, or open-door policy, invited foreign investors, but the price was high. To appease these outsiders, Sadat slashed subsidies, sparking the infamous bread uprising of 1977. Egyptians took to the streets in fury, forcing the government to reverse course temporarily. Yet the trap was set. Dependency on external loans became inevitable. When Hosni Mubarak assumed power in the 1980s, he formalized Egypt's submission to the International Monetary Fund. the loans came with suffocating conditions: privatize public assets, cut social spending, and prioritize debt repayment over public welfare. The poor bore the brunt, while a small elite enriched themselves. This wasn't development, but a deliberate impoverishment disguised as economic reform. By 2011, the Egyptian people had had enough. The Arab Spring toppled Mubarak, but the system he entrenched remained untouched. The IMF loans didn't stop. By 2016, Egypt secured a $12 billion IMF loan, agreeing to harsher austerity measures that included subsidy cuts, currency devaluation, and reduced public spending. It resulted in a devastated population and skyrocketing inflation, pushing millions into poverty. The devaluation of the Egyptian pound made daily survival a challenge for ordinary citizens. The rich stayed rich, the poor became poorer. By 2023, Egypt's external debt had ballooned to $152 billion, doubling in just 5 years. Each new loan from the IMF brought only temporary relief while ensuring long-term dependency. Egypt's plight is echoed in Angola, a nation rich in oil but trapped in the same debt spiral. For a brief moment in the early 2000s, Angola's oil boom allowed it to sidestep the IMF's chokehold. Under José Eduardo dos Santos, the country enjoyed record oil revenues, fueling double-digit GDP growth. But wealth without accountability is a double-edged sword. Instead of investing in the people, dos Santos funneled money into Sonangol, the state oil company controlled by his daughter, Isabel dos Santos. Corruption flourished, and when oil prices crashed in 2014, Angola's economy crumbled. Desperate, Angola returned to the IMF in 2016 for a bailout. But the IMF's terms were as merciless as ever: privatization, austerity, and dependency. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. There is the case of Kenya, whose descent into the IMF's trap began in earnest in the 1990s, but its devastating effects became apparent by 2011. Under IMF pressure, President Mwai Kibaki introduced a value-added tax on fertilizer, a cornerstone of Kenyan agriculture. The IMF called it a necessary reform to boost government revenue, but Kenyan economists sounded the alarm, predicting widespread inflation and economic stagnation. Fertilizer, essential for agriculture, saw its price skyrocket, which rippled across industries, increasing costs for food and basic goods. Initially, Kibaki resisted, knowing the harm such a tax would cause to the population. But relentless IMF pressure forced his hand. Inflation surged, businesses slowed, and ordinary Kenyans bore the brunt of these reforms. By 2021, under President Uhuru Kenyatta, Kenya inked another IMF deal worth $3.9 billion, paired with additional funds for climate initiatives. Fast forward to 2022, when William Ruto took office. His administration swiftly removed subsidies on essentials like maize flour and fuel, as dictated by the IMF. Prices exploded. By mid-2023, the VAT on fuel doubled from 8% to 16%, further crippling Kenyans already reeling from skyrocketing costs. Today, Kenya owes the IMF $3 billion, and the burden only grows, ensuring that future policies will cater to creditors over citizens. Then there is Ghana, a once thriving agricultural country. In the past, northern Ghana flourished as a rice-producing hub. Supported by government subsidies, local farmers not only fed the nation, but exported surplus, creating jobs and fueling the economy. However, when the IMF and World Bank entered, they ordered Ghana to dismantle subsidies for local rice production, ostensibly to liberalize markets. But the real goal was to open Ghana's markets to cheap Western imports, heavily subsidized by their own governments. Stripped of subsidies, Ghanaian farmers couldn't compete. Costs soared, profits vanished, and many abandoned farming altogether. The consequences were devastating. Once self-sufficient, Ghana now spends millions annually importing rice it could easily grow. Northern farming communities fell into poverty, jobs evaporated, and local economies crumbled. Meanwhile, Ghana's debt to the IMF ballooned to $2.26 billion, a sum repaid at the cost of its agricultural sovereignty. After giving hundreds of loans to developing countries around the world, the IMF has created a playbook of policies aimed at dependency by design. Therefore, the IMF's strategy isn't incompetence, but deliberate. If the IMF really wanted to help countries get out of debt and stand on their feet, it would have done it. But this was never the goal. The loans are tools of neocolonial control, ensuring African nations stay economically subjugated. Austerity is used as a tool where countries are forced to cut public spending on healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Poverty deepens and inequality widens. Then, nations are pushed to export raw materials while dismantling local industries, keeping them at the mercy of global markets. Public assets are sold off to Western corporations, leaving citizens with higher costs and diminished services. More loans are given, designed to be unpayable, ensuring nations must borrow more to service old debts, tightening the IMF's grip. By the early 2000s, Sub-Saharan Africa was paying a staggering $15 billion annually in debt repayments. This amount far exceeded the aid, loans, or investments African nations received in return. Between 1980 and 2004, approximately $229 billion flowed out of Africa to Western creditors. Compared to this, in 2024 alone, Africa will pay nearly $163 in debt payments to Western creditors. You can estimate how the burden of debt payments is increasing with time. Instead of funding education, healthcare, or infrastructure, this money enriched the very nations that claim to assist Africa. The system left African economies starved of the capital necessary for development, forcing governments to prioritize debt servicing over their citizens' needs. This relentless drain created a cycle of dependency, ensuring that Africa's resources fueled Western economies while its people suffered. But how does Western exploitation continue to this day, and how do the World Bank and IMF ensure it? Today, most African nations remain trapped in an export-dependent model, shipping raw materials such as oil, cocoa, and precious resources like gold, silver, diamonds, cobalt, lithium, and uranium to the West at minimal prices. These resources are then processed into finished goods and sold back to Africa at exorbitant rates. This exploitative arrangement ensures that the wealth generated by African labor and resources remains in Western hands. The IMF and World Bank have exacerbated this dependency through structural adjustment programs, which mandate that African countries prioritize exports over domestic needs. As a result, economies remain vulnerable to global market fluctuations, unable to diversify or develop local industries that could enable self-sufficiency. In all that, the true beneficiaries of IMF and World Bank policies are not African citizens, but the Western economies these institutions serve. The interest payments alone generate immense profits for wealthy nations and financial institutions. IMF-imposed policies ensure that Africa's resources remain cheap and accessible to Western corporations, while African markets are flooded with subsidized Western goods that destroy local industries. This arrangement leaves African nations dependent on imports, further enriching their creditors while hollowing out their domestic economies. Interestingly, the reporters of the IMF and World Bank's exploitation are not only the African countries facing the trouble, but various high-stake reports from Western entities. There have been various reports and studies on IMF and World Bank loans and the intentions behind them. UNICEF's 1987 report, Adjustment with a Human Face, exposed the devastating impact of structural adjustment programs mandated by the IMF and World Bank. These programs forced borrowing nations to implement austerity measures, slashing public spending on essential services like healthcare, education, and welfare. At the same time, they demanded privatization of state-owned enterprises and aggressive trade liberalization. While these policies aimed to ensure debt repayment to Western creditors, they left citizens impoverished, social services deteriorated, and economies heavily reliant on raw material exports. This over-reliance made countries vulnerable to global market fluctuations, deepening inequality and stagnation. The country's economies continued, but the citizens drowned in poverty. Even though the loans are for the citizens and these very citizens pay them, the benefits never reach them. The sole purpose behind all these loans is to ensure the survival of the economy and avoid collapse rather than growth and development. Later, Léonce Ndikumana and James Boyce, in their 2011 book Africa's Odious Debts, revealed a shocking statistic. They reported that between 1970 and 2008, Sub-Saharan Africa borrowed $540 billion but paid $580 billion in debt repayments. This net loss shows how loans became vehicles for wealth extraction rather than development. Countries like Zambia and Mozambique spent more on debt servicing than on critical areas like healthcare and education, leaving their populations trapped in cycles of poverty. The money flowed directly to Western creditors, ensuring that Africa's wealth benefited foreign interests rather than its own citizens. Another study in 2016, titled "The New Colonialism by War on Want," shed light on how IMF and World Bank policies enable multinational corporations to dominate resource-rich African nations. Under pressure to privatize and deregulate, governments opened their economies to foreign exploitation. Resources like oil, gas, and minerals were extracted cheaply, while profits flowed out of the continent. Ghana, for instance, removed subsidies for local industries under IMF conditions, crippling sectors like rice farming. The collapse of these industries paved the way for heavily subsidized Western goods to dominate local markets, further entrenching dependency. Later, the African Development Bank's 2013 report, Africa Rising, revealed how IMF and World Bank policies lock African nations into export-oriented economies. By focusing on raw material exports, these countries became vulnerable to global price fluctuations while neglecting domestic industrialization. In Kenya and Tanzania, for example, IMF enforced policies prioritized exports over local agricultural development, leading to food insecurity and economic instability. This dependency on raw material exports ensured that African economies served as suppliers for Western markets, rather than engines of self-sustaining growth. Furthermore, Patrick Bond's 2003 report, The Privatization of African Economies, detailed how IMF and World Bank loans often came with conditions requiring the privatization of essential services like water, electricity, and healthcare. While framed as necessary reforms, these privatizations typically led to higher costs and reduced access for the poor. The infamous Cochabamba water war in Bolivia, where water prices skyrocketed after privatization, serves as an example. Similar outcomes have been documented across Africa, where privatized utilities prioritize corporate profits over public welfare. Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, in his book Globalization and Its Discontents, criticized the IMF and World Bank for prioritizing the interests of Western creditors and multinational corporations. Stiglitz revealed how loan conditions, including trade liberalization and currency devaluation, triggered economic crises in nations like Indonesia, Ghana, and Zambia. These policies eroded local industries, inflated the cost of imports, and deepened poverty, all while ensuring that debt repayment took precedence over national development. The overwhelming evidence shows that the IMF and World Bank are not neutral arbiters of development, but active participants in a system of economic exploitation. Through debt traps, resource extraction, and harsh conditionalities, these institutions perpetuate a modern form of colonialism. For Africa to break free, it must reclaim its economic sovereignty, prioritize self-sufficiency, and resist the policies designed to keep it impoverished and dependent. Only then can the continent chart a path toward true development and equity. What do you think? Is borrowing good or bad? Do you believe African leaders could use the loans from the World Bank and IMF to develop countries and gradually get out of the debt trap? Or were the loans designed in such a way that they were virtually unpayable? In the comment section right below, Share your thoughts on the opinion that the West distanced itself from neocolonialism in Africa by launching organizations like the World Bank and IMF, which now control countries. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.